James Mitchell had served as a royal guard for 12 years, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to discover. The 34-year-old man stood 6 feet tall with sharp green eyes that missed nothing. His colleagues respected him, and the royal family trusted him completely. But tonight, that trust would lead him down a path that would change everything. It was a cold October evening when James received an unusual assignment. Queen Camilla's private secretary approached him with a worried expression. The elderly woman, Mrs. Henderson, had worked for the royal family for over 20 years. She rarely showed concern, but tonight was different. "James, I need your help with something delicate," she whispered, glancing around the empty corridor. "The Queen has been acting strangely lately. She disappears for hours at a time, and when I ask where she's been, she gives vague answers. Yesterday I saw her entering a part of the palace I've never seen anyone use before." James listened carefully. He had noticed some odd behavior from Queen Camilla recently. She seemed nervous during public appearances and often checked her phone with a worried expression. Sometimes she would excuse herself from meetings without explanation. Mrs. Henderson continued, "I'm concerned about her safety. What if someone is threatening her? What if she's hiding something dangerous? I need someone I trust to investigate quietly." The request made James uncomfortable. Spying on the Queen felt wrong, but Mrs. Henderson's concern seemed genuine. If Queen Camilla was in danger, it was his duty to protect her. After much thought, he agreed to look into it. The next evening, James began his investigation. He studied the palace layout carefully, paying attention to areas he had never patrolled. The palace was enormous, with countless rooms and secret passages built centuries ago. Many areas were rarely used and poorly lit. During his regular rounds, James started noticing small details he had missed before. There were fresh footprints in dusty corridors, recently disturbed furniture in forgotten rooms, and the faint scent of expensive perfume in places where no one should have been. On the third night of his investigation, James decided to follow one of the less traveled corridors. It led to the oldest part of the palace where thick stone walls muffled all sound. As he walked quietly through the darkness, he noticed a thin line of light coming from beneath a door he had never seen opened. James approached the door carefully, his heart beating faster. He could hear movement inside, along with what sounded like papers being shuffled. Someone was definitely in there, working late at night in a room that was supposed to be empty. He pressed his ear against the heavy wooden door. The sounds inside stopped suddenly, as if whoever was there had heard something. James held his breath, not daring to move. After a few moments, the sounds resumed, but now they seemed more hurried, more urgent. James knew he had to make a decision. He could report what he had found and let others investigate, or he could try to see what was happening inside that room. His training told him to be cautious, but his curiosity and concern for the Queen's safety pushed him forward. He slowly tried the door handle, expecting it to be locked. To his surprise, it turned easily. The door opened without a sound, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The light he had seen was coming from somewhere below. As James descended the stone steps, he realized he was entering a part of the palace he never knew existed. The air grew colder and the walls became rougher, as if this area had been carved directly from the rock beneath the palace. Each step echoed softly despite his efforts to move quietly. At the bottom of the staircase, James found himself in a small chamber with another door. This one was slightly open and bright light spilled through the gap. He could hear voices now, though he couldn't make out the words. One voice sounded familiar, but he couldn't place it. James approached the door and peered through the gap. What he saw made his blood run cold. Queen Camilla was there, but she wasn't alone. She was meeting with people James didn't recognize, and they were handling documents and photographs that looked official and important. But that wasn't the worst part. On a table in the center of the room, James could see stacks of money, jewelry, and what appeared to be confidential government papers. Queen Camilla was in the middle of what looked like a very serious and very illegal transaction. James realized he had stumbled upon something much bigger and more dangerous than he had imagined. This wasn't just about the Queen's strange behavior. This was about secrets that could destroy the royal family and possibly the entire government. As he watched in shock, James knew his life was about to change forever. He had to decide whether to confront what he was seeing or retreat and pretend he had never been there. But as he turned to leave, his foot knocked against a loose stone, creating a small but audible sound. The voices in the room stopped immediately. James heard footsteps approaching the door, and he realized he had only seconds to decide what to do next. His heart pounded as he pressed himself against the cold stone wall, hoping the shadows would hide him from whoever was about to emerge from that room. James held his breath as the footsteps grew closer. His mind raced with options, but there was nowhere to run. The narrow chamber had only one entrance, and someone was about to discover him. He pressed himself deeper into the shadows, hoping against hope that he could remain hidden. The door opened wider, and a tall man in an expensive suit stepped out. James recognized him immediately. It was Lord Vincent Ashworth, a wealthy businessman who often attended royal functions. But what was he doing in a secret underground room with Queen Camilla at midnight? Lord Ashworth looked around suspiciously, his cold gray eyes scanning the chamber. After a tense moment, he seemed satisfied that no one was there and returned to the room. James heard him say, "I thought I heard something, but it must have been the old building settling." Queen Camilla's voice replied, "We can't afford to be careless, Vincent. Too much depends on this arrangement staying secret." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Queen was clearly involved in something she desperately wanted to keep hidden. He needed to get closer to hear more, but moving was extremely risky. Still, his duty to protect the royal family meant he had to understand what kind of danger they might be in. Very carefully, James crept closer to the door. Now he could see more of the room through the gap. It was much larger than he had expected, with stone walls lined with shelves containing documents, photographs, and various objects. The room looked like it had been used for secret meetings for many years. Besides Queen Camilla and Lord Ashworth, there were 3 other people in the room. James recognized one as Marcus Webb, a government official who worked in the Treasury Department. The other 2 were strangers, but they carried themselves like military or intelligence personnel. On the central table, James could now see the items more clearly. There were bundles of cash in different currencies, expensive jewelry pieces, and several thick folders marked with official government seals. But what caught his attention most were the photographs scattered across the table. The photos showed various political figures, foreign dignitaries, and business leaders in what appeared to be compromising situations. Some were clearly taken without the subject's knowledge, showing private meetings, personal moments, and activities that would cause major scandals if made public. Queen Camilla picked up one of the folders and handed it to Marcus Webb. "The information in here should be enough to ensure the defense minister votes our way on the arms deal," she said calmly. James felt sick to his stomach. The Queen was using confidential information and possibly blackmail to influence government decisions. This wasn't just inappropriate behavior from a royal family member. This was serious criminal activity that could destroy the monarchy and undermine the entire government. Marcus Webb opened the folder and smiled unpleasantly. "These photos of him with that young woman will definitely change his mind about the vote. He won't want his wife to see these, especially not right before their daughter's wedding." The conversation continued, revealing more shocking details. James learned that this group had been operating for at least 2 years, using their positions and access to confidential information to manipulate political decisions, business deals, and even court cases. They had files on dozens of important people, and they weren't afraid to use those files to get what they wanted. But the most disturbing revelation came when one of the strangers asked about the American situation. Queen Camilla's expression grew serious as she replied, "Our contact in Washington has promised to share intelligence about their new defense systems. In exchange, we've agreed to provide information about our allies' military capabilities." James realized with horror that this wasn't just domestic corruption. Queen Camilla was involved in sharing state secrets with foreign powers. This was treason at the highest level, and it put national security at serious risk. As the meeting continued, James learned more about their network. They had people placed in key positions throughout the government, military, and intelligence services. They had access to classified information from multiple countries, and they were using it for personal profit and political manipulation. The Queen herself seemed to be the leader of this operation, making final decisions about which information to share, which people to target, and how to use their power for maximum effect. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable because of her position. James tried to process everything he was hearing. The woman he had sworn to protect was betraying her own country. The royal family he had dedicated his life to serving was involved in activities that could destroy the nation's security and international relationships. But his shock turned to fear when Lord Ashworth mentioned something that made his blood run cold. "We need to be more careful about palace security," he said. "I've noticed some of the guards asking questions and paying attention to areas they normally ignore." Queen Camilla nodded thoughtfully. "James Mitchell, in particular, has been more observant lately. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that he's been asking about my schedule and whereabouts. We might need to consider transferring him to a different assignment, or perhaps something more permanent." The casual way she discussed potentially eliminating him made James realize just how dangerous these people were. They had killed before, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again to protect their secrets. He was no longer just a witness to their crimes. He was now a target. James knew he had to leave immediately and figure out how to expose what he had discovered. But as he carefully began to back away from the door, he accidentally brushed against a loose stone in the wall. The stone shifted slightly, making a small scraping sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet chamber. This time, the reaction was immediate and decisive. All conversation in the room stopped, and James heard the unmistakable sound of weapons being drawn. Heavy footsteps moved quickly toward the door, and he realized he had run out of time and options. Queen Camilla's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Find whoever is out there, and make sure they never speak about what they might have seen." James didn't wait to see who would come through that door. He turned and ran toward the staircase as quietly as possible, but speed was more important than stealth now. Behind him, he heard the door burst open and angry voices shouting orders. "Check every corner," Lord Ashworth's voice echoed through the chamber. "Whoever was listening can't get far." James reached the staircase and bounded up the steps 3 at a time. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might give away his location, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He could hear his pursuers starting up the stairs behind him, their heavy boots creating an ominous rhythm on the stone steps. At the top of the staircase, James burst through the door and found himself back in the familiar palace corridor. But now this familiar place felt like enemy territory. He realized that Queen Camilla and her conspirators had been using the palace's secret passages for their meetings, which meant they knew the building's hidden areas better than anyone. James ran through the corridors, trying to think of where he could go for help. His first instinct was to contact his supervisor, but what if that person was also involved in the conspiracy? Queen Camilla had mentioned having people placed throughout the government and security services. Anyone could be working with them. As he ran, James heard voices and footsteps coming from multiple directions. They had called for backup, and now several people were searching for him. He ducked into a side corridor just as 2 figures appeared at the far end of the main hallway. In the dim light, he couldn't tell if they were regular security guards or part of the conspiracy. James knew he needed evidence of what he had seen, but he also knew he might not survive long enough to share it. He pulled out his phone and quickly typed a message to his brother Tom, who lived outside London and had no connection to the royal family or government. "Emergency. Can't explain now. If something happens to me, investigate Queen Camilla's secret meetings in palace basement. She's selling state secrets. Trust no one in government. This message is my insurance policy." He sent the message and then turned off his phone, knowing they could track him through it. Now he had to figure out how to survive long enough for someone to investigate his claims. The palace seemed different now that James knew about the hidden passages and secret rooms. Every shadow could hide an enemy, and every sound could signal danger. He moved carefully through areas he knew well, but even familiar places felt threatening. James made his way toward the outer sections of the palace, hoping to reach an exit where he could escape into the city. But as he approached the main entrance hall, he saw 2 men in dark suits stationed near the doors. They weren't regular palace security, and they were clearly watching for someone trying to leave. Trapped inside the palace with enemies searching for him, James had to find another way out. He remembered the service tunnels that connected the palace to nearby government buildings. These tunnels were used for secure transportation of important officials and were known only to the highest levels of security personnel. James made his way to the basement levels through a series of maintenance corridors. The lower levels of the palace were like a maze, with pipes, electrical systems, and storage areas creating countless hiding places. But they also provided numerous opportunities for ambushes. As he moved through the basement, James heard voices echoing through the corridors. They were getting closer, and he realized they were using systematic search patterns to check every possible hiding place. These weren't amateurs. They were trained professionals who knew how to hunt someone in a building. James found the entrance to the service tunnels, but it required a security code that changed daily. As a royal guard, he knew the current code, but using it would create a digital record of his location. However, he had no choice. The voices were getting louder, and he could hear footsteps approaching his corridor. He entered the code and slipped into the tunnel system just as lights appeared at the far end of the corridor behind him. The tunnels were narrow and poorly lit, but they offered his best chance of escaping the palace undetected. The service tunnels stretched for several miles underground, connecting the palace to various government buildings and safe houses throughout central London. James had studied the tunnel maps as part of his security training, but navigating them in the dark while being hunted was completely different from classroom exercises. As he moved through the tunnels, James tried to process everything he had learned. Queen Camilla wasn't just involved in corruption or blackmail. She was running a sophisticated espionage network that threatened national security. The scope of the operation suggested it had been planned for years and involved people at the highest levels of government. But who could he trust with this information? His supervisor reported to officials who might be compromised. The police could have infiltrators. Even the intelligence services might have been penetrated by Queen Camilla's network. James realized he needed to find someone outside the normal chain of command. Someone with the authority and resources to investigate the conspiracy, but who wasn't likely to be involved in it. He thought about investigative journalists, opposition politicians, or perhaps foreign intelligence services that might be interested in exposing the network. After walking for what felt like hours through the dark tunnels, James reached an exit that led to a building several blocks away from the palace. He carefully opened the heavy metal door and found himself in the basement of an office building that housed several government departments. The building was mostly empty at this late hour, but James moved carefully anyway. He knew that Queen Camilla's people might have anticipated his use of the tunnel system and could be waiting for him at any of the exits. James made his way to the building's main floor and looked out at the London streets. Everything looked normal, but he knew appearances could be deceiving. For all he knew, there were people watching every possible exit point, waiting for him to emerge. As he stood in the lobby of the office building, James realized his life had completely changed. He could never return to his normal duties as a royal guard. He could never trust his colleagues or supervisors again. He was now a fugitive from people who had the resources of the royal family and possibly the government at their disposal. But he also knew he had information that could expose one of the most serious threats to national security in British history. Queen Camilla and her network were selling state secrets, manipulating government decisions, and potentially compromising the safety of the entire nation. James took a deep breath and stepped out into the London night. He had to find a way to expose the truth, even if it cost him everything. The stakes were too high to worry about his own safety. The future of the country might depend on what he did next. James walked through the quiet London streets, staying in shadows and avoiding main roads. Every car that passed made him nervous, and every person he saw could be a potential threat. He needed to find someone he could trust, but his options were extremely limited. After walking for an hour, James remembered Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist he had met 2 years ago during a security briefing at the palace. She worked for The Independent and had a reputation for exposing government corruption. More importantly, she had no connections to the royal family or the political establishment that might be compromised. James found a payphone, something that was becoming increasingly rare in London, and looked up the newspaper's main number. It was nearly 3 a.m., but he knew that major newspapers always had someone on duty for breaking news emergencies. When someone answered, James asked to speak with Sarah Chen. After several transfers and explanations that it was an urgent matter involving national security, he finally heard Sarah's voice on the line. "This is Sarah Chen. Who is this and why are you calling me at 3 in the morning?" James took a deep breath. "My name is James Mitchell. I'm a royal guard at Buckingham Palace. I have information about a conspiracy involving Queen Camilla that threatens national security." I need to meet with you immediately. There was a long pause. Sarah was probably deciding whether this was a legitimate news tip or a call from someone with mental health issues. Finally, she responded, "If this is real, why aren't you going through official channels?" "Because I don't know who else is involved," James replied. "The conspiracy reaches into the government and security services. I witnessed Queen Camilla involved in selling state secrets and blackmailing government officials. My life is in danger, and this information needs to get out before they silence me permanently." Sarah agreed to meet him at an all-night diner in East London, far from the government district and the areas where James might be recognized. She warned him that she would bring a photographer and that she would need substantial proof before publishing such serious accusations. James spent the next hour traveling across London using public transportation, constantly checking to see if he was being followed. He changed buses twice and took a circuitous route to make it harder for anyone tracking him. The diner was nearly empty when James arrived. Sarah was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a clear view of the entrance. She was in her early 30s with short black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. Next to her sat a bearded man with a camera who she introduced as her photographer, Mike. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Sarah said as James sat down across from them. "Tell me everything, but start with proof. I need to know you're not wasting my time with conspiracy theories." James pulled out his Royal Guard identification and showed them photos on his phone that he had taken of the secret room's entrance during his previous investigations. He also showed them the message he had sent to his brother as insurance. Then he began telling them everything he had witnessed. He described the secret vault, the people involved, the documents and money he had seen, and the conversations about blackmail and selling state secrets. Sarah took notes rapidly, occasionally asking for clarification or more specific details. "This is incredible," Sarah said when he finished. "If even half of what you're telling me is true, this would be the biggest royal scandal in British history. But I need more than your word. I need documentary evidence, photographs, or recordings." James had expected this response. "I understand, but going back to get evidence would be suicide. They're already searching for me, and they've made it clear that they're willing to kill to protect their secrets." Mike, the photographer, leaned forward. "What if we could get you equipment to document the evidence safely? Hidden cameras, recording devices, things that would let you gather proof without being detected?" James considered the idea, but he shook his head. "The secret room will be heavily guarded now. They know someone was listening to their meeting. They'll either move their operation or increase security to the point where getting back in would be impossible." Sarah tapped her pen against her notepad thoughtfully. "What about other evidence? You mentioned that this conspiracy involves people throughout the government. There must be records, communications, financial transactions that would support your story." "The problem is accessing those records without alerting the people involved," James replied. "Queen Camilla mentioned having contacts in intelligence services, the Treasury Department, and the military. Any official investigation could be compromised before it even begins." As they talked, James noticed a black sedan driving slowly past the diner for the second time. His training made him pay attention to such details, and something about the car's movement pattern worried him. "We need to leave," James said suddenly, standing up from the booth. "I think we've been found." Sarah and Mike looked out the window and saw the sedan parking across the street. Two men in dark clothing got out and began walking toward the diner. They moved with the purposeful stride of people on a mission. "Back exit," Mike said, grabbing his camera equipment. The three of them quickly made their way through the diner's kitchen, past surprised staff members, and out the rear door into an alley. As they reached the street behind the diner, they heard shouting from inside the building. The men had discovered that their targets had escaped and were now searching the area. Sarah led them to her car, which was parked several blocks away. As they drove through London, she continued asking James questions about the conspiracy. She wanted names, dates, specific details that could be verified independently. "I believe your story," Sarah said, "but my editor will need corroborating evidence before we can publish anything. Accusing the Queen of treason is not something we can do based solely on one person's testimony." James understood her position, but he was running out of options. "What if I could get you access to someone else who knows about the conspiracy?" "Queen Camilla mentioned Mrs. Henderson, my supervisor, asking questions about my activities. She might have suspected something was wrong." "That could work," Sarah replied. "If we can find other witnesses or people with knowledge of the conspiracy, we can build a stronger case." But we need to be very careful about who we approach. If word gets back to Queen Camilla that we're investigating, she'll either destroy the evidence or eliminate everyone who knows about it. They drove to a safe house that Sarah's newspaper used for protecting sources during sensitive investigations. It was a modest apartment in a residential area, equipped with secure communications equipment and basic surveillance countermeasures. Once they were inside, Sarah began making calls to her contacts in government and intelligence circles. She was careful not to reveal the specific nature of her investigation, but she started asking general questions about unusual activities involving the royal family and potential security concerns. Meanwhile, James tried to contact Mrs. Henderson using a secure phone line. He needed to warn her that she might be in danger and see if she had any additional information about Queen Camilla's activities. Mrs. Henderson answered on the first ring, as if she had been expecting his call. "James, thank God you're safe. There are people looking for you everywhere. They're saying you've gone rogue and pose a security threat to the royal family." "Mrs. Henderson, I need you to listen carefully," James said. "Queen Camilla is involved in a conspiracy that threatens national security. I witnessed her selling state secrets and planning to blackmail government officials. Your life may be in danger because you asked me to investigate her strange behavior." There was a long silence before Mrs. Henderson responded. "I was afraid of something like this. I've been working for the royal family for 20 years, and I've never seen behavior like what Queen Camilla has been displaying recently. She's been secretive, paranoid, and she's been meeting with people who have no business being in the palace." Mrs. Henderson agreed to meet with Sarah and provide whatever additional information she could, but first she needed to secure her own safety and gather any documents or evidence that might support James's claims. As dawn approached, James realized that he had set in motion events that would either expose one of the most serious threats to British national security in decades or result in his own death. But there was no turning back now. Too many people knew the truth, and the conspiracy was too dangerous to ignore. The meeting with Mrs. Henderson was arranged for later that morning at a small cafe in Camden, far from the palace and government district. James felt nervous about exposing her to danger, but her testimony could be crucial for establishing the credibility of his claims. While they waited, Sarah had been busy working her contacts. She had discovered some interesting financial irregularities involving several of the people James had identified as part of the conspiracy. Large, unexplained payments had been made to offshore accounts, and there were records of unusual meetings between government officials and foreign representatives. "I'm starting to find independent verification of parts of your story," Sarah told James. "Marcus Webb from the Treasury has been flagged by financial intelligence for suspicious transactions. Lord Ashworth has connections to arms dealers and foreign intelligence services that weren't previously known to authorities." This evidence gave James hope, but he knew they still needed more substantial proof to expose the full scope of the conspiracy. Queen Camilla's involvement was the most serious aspect, but also the hardest to prove without direct documentation. Mrs. Henderson arrived at the cafe precisely on time, looking nervous but determined. She carried a small briefcase and constantly checked over her shoulder as she approached their table. "I've brought everything I could find," she said quietly, opening the briefcase. Inside were photocopies of Queen Camilla's private schedule, records of unusual visitors to the palace, and financial documents showing payments to security companies and private investigators. "These visitors," Mrs. Henderson explained, pointing to names on the list, started appearing about 2 years ago. They would meet with Queen Camilla in private, always late at night, and always in areas of the palace where they wouldn't be seen by regular staff. Sarah examined the documents carefully. Several of the names matched people who were known to have connections to foreign intelligence services or international criminal organizations. The pattern of meetings suggested regular contact for business purposes rather than social visits. "There's something else," Mrs. Henderson said, lowering her voice further. "Last month, I accidentally saw Queen Camilla's personal email account when she left her laptop open. There were messages about merchandise deliveries and client satisfaction that didn't make sense in the context of royal duties. She had managed to take photos of some of these emails with her phone. When Sarah reviewed them, she found references to classified information being shared, payments being made to foreign accounts, and discussions about eliminating obstacles to their operations. But their meeting was interrupted when Mike, who had been watching the street from the window, suddenly stood up. "We have company," he said grimly. 3 black SUVs just pulled up outside and men in suits are getting out. James looked out and saw at least 6 armed men surrounding the cafe. These weren't police officers making an arrest. They were private security contractors, the kind of people who ask questions after shooting first. "Is there a back exit?" James asked the cafe owner, a middle-aged Pakistani man who had been watching the situation with growing concern. "Kitchen leads to an alley," the owner replied, "but they probably have that covered too." James was right. Through the kitchen window they could see 2 more armed men positioning themselves in the alley. Queen Camilla's people had found them and were prepared to eliminate everyone who knew about the conspiracy. "We need to create a distraction," Sarah said, thinking quickly. "Mike, start filming everything. If we're going to be killed, at least we can leave evidence of who did it." Mrs. Henderson was frightened but determined. "I have one more thing that might help," she said, pulling out a small recording device. "I've been secretly recording Queen Camilla's phone conversations for the past month. I was worried about her behavior and wanted evidence in case something happened to me." She played a brief section of one recording. Queen Camilla's voice was clearly audible, discussing the sale of submarine design specifications to a foreign buyer. In the same conversation, she mentioned dealing with a government official who was asking too many questions about defense contracts. This was exactly the kind of direct evidence they needed, but it would be worthless if they didn't survive to share it. The armed men were now entering the cafe, and James could see that they were carrying weapons designed for close-quarters combat. The cafe owner, whose name was Ahmed, stepped forward bravely. "These are paying customers," he told the armed men. "You cannot come into my business and threaten people." The lead man, who James recognized as one of the figures from the secret room, pushed Ahmed aside roughly. "We're looking for James Mitchell and anyone who's been talking to him. This is a matter of national security." James stood up, knowing that hiding was pointless. "I'm James Mitchell," he said. "But if you kill us, you'll only make things worse. This information is already out there. Killing us won't stop the truth from coming out." The lead man smiled coldly. "Actually, it will. You see, we've been monitoring your communications. We know exactly who you've contacted and what information you've shared. After we finish here, we'll be paying visits to your brother, your friends, and anyone else who might have received inconvenient messages." But James had anticipated this possibility. The message he had sent to his brother contained instructions to share the information with multiple news outlets and government officials if anything happened to James. It also included a dead man's switch that would automatically release the information if James didn't check in within 24 hours. Sarah had been busy during the confrontation, using her phone to live stream the entire encounter to her newspaper's social media accounts. Thousands of people were now watching the situation unfold in real time, making it impossible for Queen Camilla's people to simply eliminate the witnesses and cover up the incident. "You're too late," Sarah announced to the armed men. "This conversation is being broadcast live to news outlets across the country. Killing us now will only confirm everything we've reported about Queen Camilla's conspiracy." The lead man's expression changed as he realized the situation had spiraled beyond their control. They had planned a simple elimination operation, but now they were facing a public relations disaster that could expose the entire conspiracy. James seized the opportunity. "You have one chance to minimize the damage," Donnie told the lead man. "Let us go and we might be willing to negotiate terms for revealing the full scope of the conspiracy. Kill us, and everything becomes public immediately." But the lead man had apparently decided that eliminating the witnesses was still the best option, regardless of the public attention. He raised his weapon and prepared to fire when the sound of police sirens filled the air. Ahmed had managed to call the police when the armed men first entered his cafe. Multiple police units were now surrounding the building, and the situation had become far more complicated than Queen Camilla's people had planned. Through the cafe windows, James could see that a crowd of onlookers had gathered, many of them filming the police response with their phones. The incident was becoming a major news story in real time, making it impossible for the conspiracy to be covered up. The lead man spoke quickly into a radio, apparently receiving instructions from Queen Camilla or her associates. After a brief conversation, he looked at James with obvious frustration. "This isn't over," he said. "You may have won this round, but you have no idea how powerful the people you're fighting really are. This conspiracy reaches further than you can imagine, and we have resources you haven't even discovered yet. As police officers entered the cafe, the armed men suddenly became cooperative, identifying themselves as government security personnel responding to a terrorist threat. But James knew this was just another layer of the cover-up, and the real battle for truth was just beginning. The police station was chaotic. James, Sarah, Mike, and Mrs. Henderson were all being held for questioning, but they weren't sure if the officers interviewing them were legitimate police or part of Queen Camilla's network. The armed men from the cafe had been released within hours, claiming they were conducting authorized government security operations. Detective Inspector Rachel Morgan was assigned to James's case. She seemed genuinely confused by the conflicting stories and the high-level pressure she was receiving to either release James immediately or charge him with serious crimes. The political interference was unlike anything she had experienced in 15 years of police work. "I've been a detective for a long time," Detective Morgan told James during their interview. "I've learned to recognize when powerful people are trying to control an investigation. The number of phone calls I've received about your case in the past 6 hours is unprecedented." James realized that Detective Morgan might be someone he could trust. She seemed to be operating independently of the conspiracy, and her frustration with the political pressure suggested she was committed to finding the truth, regardless of who it might implicate. "Detective Morgan," James said carefully, "I need you to understand that this case involves threats to national security at the highest levels. The people trying to suppress this investigation aren't just protecting themselves. They're protecting a conspiracy that could undermine the entire government." Meanwhile, Sarah's live stream from the cafe had gone viral. News outlets around the world were picking up the story, and social media was buzzing with speculation about royal family corruption. The attempted cover-up was creating more attention than the original revelation might have received. The pressure from international media forced the government to announce an official investigation. But James knew that any investigation conducted through normal channels would likely be compromised. Too many of the people involved in the conspiracy held positions of authority in the very institutions that were supposed to investigate them. Mrs. Henderson was released first, but not before she had managed to share copies of all her evidence with Detective Morgan. The financial records, visitor logs, and recorded conversations provided a substantial foundation for building a case against Queen Camilla and her associates. Then came an unexpected development. James's brother Tom, who had received the emergency message, had been working with a group of investigative journalists and former intelligence officers who specialized in exposing government corruption. This group had connections throughout Europe and America, and they had been quietly investigating similar conspiracies in other countries. Tom arrived at the police station with a lawyer and several people James didn't recognize. One was introduced as former MI6 officer David Crawford, who had been investigating international espionage networks for the past decade. "Your brother's message led us to some very interesting discoveries," Crawford told James. "We've been tracking financial flows between British officials and foreign intelligence services, and your evidence fits perfectly with patterns we've been seeing." Crawford explained that Queen Camilla's conspiracy wasn't unique. Similar networks existed in several other countries, all connected through a web of financial relationships and shared intelligence. The scope was much larger than James had realized, involving not just British national security but international stability. "The good news," Crawford continued, "is that we have allies in multiple governments who are working to expose these networks. The bad news is that the people you're fighting have resources and connections that extend far beyond Britain." Over the next 48 hours, the story continued to develop rapidly. Sarah's newspaper published a detailed exposé based on the evidence they had gathered, and other journalists began investigating connections to the conspiracy. Financial records showed millions of pounds flowing through offshore accounts, and phone records revealed communications between British officials and known foreign intelligence operatives. Queen Camilla initially denied all accusations, claiming she was the victim of a smear campaign by people trying to destabilize the monarchy. But as more evidence became public, her position became increasingly difficult to maintain. The most damaging revelation came when Crawford's team released intercepted communications showing Queen Camilla discussing specific military secrets with foreign contacts. The recordings were authenticated by multiple independent experts, and they provided direct evidence of treason. Public opinion turned decisively against Queen Camilla as people realized the extent of her betrayal. Protests erupted outside Buckingham Palace, and members of Parliament began calling for her immediate arrest and prosecution, but the conspiracy fought back viciously. James received death threats, and several witnesses disappeared or died in suspicious circumstances. Sarah's newspaper office was firebombed, and Detective Morgan was reassigned to a different case under mysterious circumstances. The final breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lord Ashworth, apparently realizing that the conspiracy was collapsing, decided to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. His testimony revealed the complete structure of the network, including names of all participants and details of their operations. The evidence showed that Queen Camilla had been selling state secrets for over 3 years, earning millions of pounds while compromising national security. She had used her position to access classified information about military capabilities, intelligence operations, and diplomatic negotiations. The conspiracy had also been involved in assassinating people who threatened to expose their operations. At least 6 deaths that had previously been ruled accidental or suicide were now being investigated as murders committed to protect the network. James testified before a special parliamentary committee investigating the conspiracy. His detailed account of what he had witnessed in the secret vault provided crucial evidence for understanding how the network operated. "I took an oath to protect the royal family," James told the committee, "but I also took an oath to protect my country. When I discovered that Queen Camilla was betraying Britain, I had to choose between my loyalty to her and my loyalty to the nation. That choice was easy to make." The investigation ultimately led to the arrest of Queen Camilla and 17 other people involved in the conspiracy. The evidence gathered by James, Sarah, Mrs. Henderson, and their allies resulted in convictions for treason, espionage, murder, and conspiracy. Queen Camilla was sentenced to life in prison, and the monarchy faced its most serious crisis in centuries. The revelations about her activities led to major reforms in how the royal family is monitored and what access they have to classified information. James was eventually cleared of all charges and received recognition for his courage in exposing the conspiracy, but he chose not to return to his position as a royal guard. Instead, he joined Crawford's team investigating international corruption networks, using his experience to help expose similar conspiracies in other countries. The cafe owner Ahmed received a reward for his bravery in calling the police and protecting the witnesses. Sarah won several journalism awards for her coverage of the story, and her newspaper became known for fearless investigative reporting. Mrs. Henderson retired from royal service, but continued to work with investigators, helping them understand the full extent of the conspiracy's penetration into government institutions. The case became a landmark in British legal history, demonstrating that no one, regardless of their position or power, was above the law. It also showed the importance of ordinary citizens having the courage to speak truth to power, even when doing so put their lives at risk. James often reflected on that night when he first discovered the secret vault. A simple investigation into Queen Camilla's strange behavior had uncovered one of the most serious threats to national security in British history. His decision to trust his instincts and pursue the truth, despite the personal danger, had helped protect his country from ongoing betrayal at the highest levels of power. The conspiracy's exposure led to lasting changes in how governments monitor and investigate potential security threats from within their own ranks. It served as a reminder that vigilance against corruption and betrayal must be constant, and that sometimes the greatest threats come from those who are trusted the most.